Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Oregon Ballroom 203-204. I hope you've been having a great conference so far. My name is Peter, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker for the morning, Sebastian. And Sebastian will be speaking on creating command line interfaces with Click. So Sebastian, take it away. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'll be starting off with I've given a couple of talks before, but this is the biggest crowd I've been in front of, so I'm a little bit shaky, a little bit nervous. I hope I'll get through this and you'll enjoy it as much as I'm freaked out. So, quick introduction to myself. I'm Sebastian. I live in Vancouver. This is my... Oh, interesting. Let's see if we can fix that real quick. Or maybe not. Okay, so I'll just go with that. I'm a backend engineer. I work at Mobify. And we mostly work with Django. We have a couple of Flask apps. We also do a lot of JavaScript. But my domain is mostly around working with Django projects. I'm also one of the organizers of the Python meetup and the Django meetup in Vancouver. So why am I giving this talk? And actually, if you had a chance to see either Alex Gaynor or Kate Heddleston and Joyce Chang talk yesterday about usable ops and automating of workflows, this was sort of quite a good introduction into what I'm trying to tell you today, and introduce basically one tool that you can use to achieve that is like codifying the things that we do in our day-to-day lives, working, building web applications, deploying them to servers, rolling back, applying database migrations. Things like that are tasks that we have to do over and over and over again. And they are something that we can document, but it's easier to just put it into code and document that code, but make it easy for someone to reuse it rather than having to go through manual commands. So I've always tried to do that sort of codifying of tasks that I'm pretty sure I have to do again and again and again. And through that, I've looked at a couple of different tools. I've looked at tools that come with Python, writing scripts just as they are. And so I want to share with you a little bit of the experience that I've had and the things that I've learned. But first, just a really quick terminology thing, what I'm going to use throughout the slides. When I'm talking about parameters on the command line, so we're talking about command line tools, and parameters are basically all the things that come after the command line tool's name itself. And they are separated into arguments and options. Arguments are mandatory. They are just values that get passed in. And like in this example, we have PG client, which is a command line interface to connect to Postgres. And the argument in this case is a URL encoded credentials host name for whichever Postgres instance I'm going to connect to. Options, as the name says, are optional parameters. They come in different shapes or form. The most common one is having a name and a value attached to it. But there is also flags that have an implied value. So I have a default, and with using that option name, I toggle it on or off depending on what the default is. Here are a couple of examples. Okay. No.
Try to go to arrangement, no, scale, sorry, display, scale, scale.
Oh, scale. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and go, yeah, go this one. Okay, and now.
Yay! Sorry about that. Okay, so better quality this time. So commands is the other thing that I want to define first, or subcommands. One of the great benefits of CLIC is basically nesting of commands, providing a little bit modularity within the command line interface so that not all the options are at the top level. So if you, for example, have done a -help on uWSGI, for example, you get pages and pages of options that are really confusing, and some of them just apply to a subset of other options or things like that. So in this case, this tool basically has two commands. One is AWS and the other one is instances. And then there is options like the region that just specifically applies to that AWS command. Taking a little step into like plain Python, we can basically just take a script and use it like a bash script, but use Python in it, and import sys, look at sys.argv, and look at what are the arguments, have any arguments been passed to this command line client, and then process them in some way. So pretty straightforward in this case. The limitations of that obviously are manual parsing. I have to either like take the approach of, well, this is positional, so the first argument is a URL and the second argument is something else. Or I have to start implementing parsing of those options and flags and things like that. Which is a little bit pointless because there is enough frameworks that already do that kind of work, and there is even stuff in the standard library. And then there is input validation. To some extent, that's probably something that I have to do anyways, but some come by default in frameworks. And then there is help text formatting, which would basically be a series of print statements or things like that. And Python comes with some libraries that already allow us to do some of that work. So opparse and argparse are probably things that you're all familiar with. And one of the other more popular ones is docopt. And then there is a whole bunch of like smaller tools that have their audiences, have specific things that they are trying to achieve. Looking at opparse, that was part of, or is still part of the standard library, which was a default for a very long time. But now has been deprecated since version 3.2. It was basically, it has an option parser object. I can define several options, and then internally the parse args at the bottom of this basically extract all those defined options and gives me all the remaining arguments in a list or a tuple. So this is already better. It gives me a little bit of control over options, but I get the arguments at the end still as something that's not necessarily validated. Argparse has now, or is now considered the default in the standard library and is supposed to replace opparse. It basically doesn't deviate too much from opparse. It just gives a little bit more control over arguments and allows validation and type automatically converting into specific types and things like that for options and arguments. And then docopt is taking a very different approach to that. It takes the documentation first approach. So basically, you're writing the documentation for your command line client in a doc string. And then docopt infers from that what the options are, which ones are optional, which ones are mandatory, and potentially what kind of types they have. Which is definitely a very nice approach to writing documentation first. And I do encourage taking a look at that. What I found a little bit more than 2 years ago was Click as one of the options that sort of resonated with me. And I'm not saying that this is the best way of doing it. It's probably a pick the tool for the job, but I do really enjoy working with it. And I've used it for most of the command line clients that I've written since then. It's a small library written by Armin Ronacher, who is also the author of Flask and several other tools. It's currently in version 6, and you can see the website here for documentation. I like it because it's very intuitive to work with. It's very Pythonic in how to do things. It allows the nestability of those commands and is very composable. And I like it for the handling of inputs and outputs. And it has a very good description of why Click, looking at other options as well, in their documentation. These slides will be up on Speaker Deck, by the way, so these are all linked through, and you can take a look if you're interested. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a little example and step-by-step put together a command line client with Click to give you an idea of what this sort of looks like. So the example that I take is buying a bike from a site that is not Craigslist, and you have a search that you put in, and you get a list of search results, but there is no way of getting an email notification of what the latest ads were that somebody posted. So we write a little tool around that just takes the URL, does some web scraping, extracts the ads, caches them, and for all the new ones, sends out an email. We don't worry about the implementation of scraping and stuff like that. There are a million talks and videos out there that cover that to exhaust. So setting up a command line client in Click is fairly simple. All you have to do is pip install Click. And then there is your project setup, which I have a little cookie cutter project for Click that I use for all my command line clients. It's opinionated to what I like, but feel free to take a look. And I've also put this little example up on GitHub as well. So the most basic thing that you can do, and if you run that cookie cutter template, that's actually what you get after you provide a couple of names and things like that, is our command line client is called add notifier, and we run it, and it just prints out, I am the add notifier CLI. And this is fairly trivial to implement with Click. You just do an import of Click, and then Click is decorator-based, and you just wrap the function that you want to run in that decorator and turn it into the command. So here we just turn main into the main entry point for our command line client, and whenever we run that, it just executes that print statement. So the first thing that we have to do for our little example is basically make it possible to add a URL, pass that URL into our command line client. In this case, we're basically talking about an argument. And so the way we specify arguments is using another decorator and say, this decorator is called URL. Click will do some validation. In this case, it'll just make sure that it's there and that it is a string. And then it passes it in as the first argument into that function that this decorator wraps. And then we can do all of our scraping and all that kind of stuff, provide some output, whatever we want to do. As I said, this is sort of the example sending out an email. So let's add an email address that we can use to actually send the email to. And this will basically look a little bit like that. ~email is the option, and then I specify the email address on the command line, and it adds sending out an email using an SMTP of some sort. So we're looking at options now. And again, another decorator that we just add on top of that. We specify what the name is of that option. and that option gets validated. If it's there, it'll get passed in as email into the function, and if it's not there, it'll be none. And there's also a nifty little feature for like 12 factorizing little tools that you run on a server or something like that. You can actually not specify it and let Click pull it out of an environment variable if that's the kind of thing that, that you want to do. And with that, we have our email notification that we send out. But so far, we haven't actually done any like processing of, like we just send out an email every time that thing runs, and it gives us the full list. So let's say we have some caching implemented, but because we want to run this, testing it a little bit, we can add a reset cache flag to just reset that and start from scratch. So here we get into options as flags. And these flags are fairly easy to specify as well. Like it's the same option decorator, we just provide the default. In this case, we make it false. And then the isFlag argument that we pass in basically turns it into a flag, which makes it a toggle and makes it not require a value. And with that, we can use that now and get like either use the cache or we reset the cache. But this is a little bit ridiculous because that means I'm running the tool, I get sent an email, and I probably would be quicker just like looking at the URL in the first place. So turning this into a periodic task that I can run on a server is a good way of saying like I want to run this in two ways. I want to run this as a periodic task, or I want to run it once just like locally for testing purposes and stuff like that. So this is where the subcommands and the nesting comes in. We have to do a little bit of refactoring for that. So the first thing that we do is we take out all the logic that we have in our main function and move it out into a separate function. And then we create something that's called a group. We wrap our main entry point into the command line client in a group. And then we can create a new function, and this is basically the command that will be exposed on the command line client. We call that run once in our case, and then we use, instead of click.command, we use main.command, the group that we used in the previous slide, and create that first level of nesting. So this is now a subcommand, and as you saw here, the way we would call that is we pass in the URL as the first argument and then specify either run once or run periodically as our two commands. And then for our periodic task, we potentially have an additional option that's like run every 5 minutes. That gives us a little bit of control of the frequency. And then we use like a little scheduler that runs our task, and that's basically it. What you might have seen there is we have the arguments and options on both of those nested commands, which obviously isn't the driest way of actually handling this. So there is a very nice feature that is global, using global settings, or what they are called in Click, contexts. And so looking at this, we can basically move our options and arguments onto the group definition of our command line client, rather than have it duplicated on the nested commands. And then from there, use a little feature called pass context, which internally Click is using context for every command that's run. So we've used contexts before, but they are never really apparent to us unless we want to see them. And with this pass context, we get as the first argument to our function the context passed. And we can then use that context, which has a special attribute obj. We can use that to add custom objects, or in our case, a dictionary to it, and then pass this into our children or subcommands. So doing it this way basically means specifying pass context on our subcommand will give us access to that context object, and we can just take out that dictionary, and in this case, just forward it into our process URL. And this basically then also simplifies the schedule subcommand, where we have our periodic task in our scheduler, and we can use the same thing. We don't have to replicate it. It just makes it a lot easier. And one thing that I haven't touched on yet is the documentation of this. So let's assume we want somebody to use that tool other than me who wrote it. Obviously, we want some documentation. What are the inputs that are required? What is the text that I'm looking for? So here we look at, this is basically just what comes out if I forget to pass in the argument, which is mandatory. And give me a second. So basically, this is without specifying an argument. It just assumes I don't really know what I'm doing or how this works. So it's printing out a very sort of familiar-looking command line client documentation. And we can basically, the check pink bike ads for URLs are just things that are taken from our function. So this is just a doc string that gets parsed and then added on top of my command line client for the group that we have. And then for all the subcommands correspondingly, I can just like define those doc strings and get the same description. So if we look back at this, down there you can see the commands that are available and their documentation, and they are basically in the doc strings of those functions. And then we have, for the options and the flags, we basically can use help equals argument that we pass to that decorator to specify a little help text that makes it easier for the user to understand, which is fairly similar to what opparse and argparse are doing as well. And with that, I hope that illustrated a little bit how easy it is with Click to actually write command line clients. And from my perspective, the decorator approach is something that I find really intuitive and really easy to use. And the nesting of groups is something that has helped me sort of build up more complex clients that have different functionality, but can be shipped as like a single command where I only have to remember that one command and not have like 5 different command line clients that I package up. And then there is easy validation of inputs in terms of making sure that like options that are options getting validated, that flags are parsed in the right way. And there is also a couple of things on top of that, like parameter types that I didn't really have the time to go into, that allow more specific parsing of the types of an input. So I can specify this has to be an integer, and if that validation fails, then instead of accepting that and I have to handle it manually, I immediately get feedback from Click as a user saying this is the wrong type. There is also a way of specifying parameter types, custom parameter types. So it's definitely worth a look at the documentation, looking at environment variables, as I showed briefly, looking at parameter types. Click comes with a testing framework that doesn't really cover unit testing, but actually covers the testing and execution of the entire pipeline through Click. And then it comes with bash autocompletion, which might not be that necessary for your use cases, but it's definitely a nifty little feature. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. We have time for a few minutes worth of questions. There are 2 microphones set up if you'd like to make your way there. And let's please remember what Brandon Rhodes, our illustrious chair, said. Please phrase your question in the form of a question. So let's start over here on my right. Thank you.
What's gained with using that inbuilt scheduler versus cron?
So one of the reasons I've started doing some of these things is we are using Docker in a production environment, and especially when you're looking at certain providers that give you hosted solutions, you don't have access or you can't run them as root. So setting something like cron up inside a Docker container can turn into a little bit of a difficult task because of permissions and assumptions. So for things like that, a scheduler might be the easier way of doing that. But it's obviously an option to just like have it run one time and execute in cron. For me, it was merely to illustrate the nesting of commands in Click in this case.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
running a victim support group for people who've used the built-in argument parsers. And geez. I noticed you began your talk talking about docopt, which was really nice. But then you sort of didn't really give an example of how docopt was going to work with Click. And so I'm going to ask you, can you just kind of illustrate that? Because I'm become a big docopt fan. Wow. You know.
Can you, when you say illustrate, what exactly?
In other words, with docopt, you're using the first doc string as your argument, you know, display, and it parses it and hands you back a dictionary with all the cool responses of the user at the time of the instance, at the time you ran the command line. And I was wondering how that kind of dances with Click. Do you understand? That seemed like a really you're using your own doc strings within your various sub-functions, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, Click uses doc strings to extract help text for itself. I actually have no idea whether docopt and Click play nice together or like conflict in any way. There is obviously ways of documenting in a similar style to docopt with Click, but Click provides all of that formatted output for you by specifying the arguments and the options in your decorator. And there is a lot of granularity that you can go into, and then it generates documentation from that. So it's basically a different approach to writing your command line client. One is from documentation, you infer the validation, and in the other one, you basically define what you want to have validated and then generate documentation from that.
In your experience, has there been a collision between when you do an include of docopt and you do an include of Click and then go at it? Have they played relatively well together?
I haven't done anything like that.
Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you have any suggestions on or knowledge on what sort of things would take to switch from using argparse to Click or like, because I have a monolithic argparse program.
That's a good question. I don't really have experience in the sense that like I had an undertaking like that. Most of the scripts that I've written started out as like small scripts of like 2-3 functions and then went from that to become a little bit more. But the ones that I've written so far have still been very small and contained. I think there might be a way of like maybe taking a couple of specific parts out of it, of the existing monolith and move them over, like taking one group of functionality and start it off as a group of commands and then basically start adding more and more nested commands to it from that monolith. that would be something that might be a way of doing it like in a step-by-step process and documenting how to move forward from that.
Thank you.
I think we're going to have to end it there, but let's give Sebastian another round of applause. Thank you, Sebastian.